All right, what's up? We're about to get into the nitty gritty. Now, this is a part 6 following up our atoms to compounds video. And again, I'm doing this for the purpose of building up to help you understand ADP and ATP. That's adenosine diphosphate, which means that it has 2 phosphate groups, and adenosine triphosphate, which means it has 3 phosphate groups. And these are considered nucleotides. And these nucleotides are responsible for the main components and the energy packaging and utilization of cells to help our cells to function and operate properly. Go back and look at my muscle contraction videos and you'll get a better understanding of how ADP and ATP works in that specific process. But anyway, we're going to get straight into it because I don't want to drag this video out too long. We're going to start talking about the atom. Now, as I stated previously, you have to understand the atom at the fundamental level all the way down to the compounds to really understand how ADP and ATP operates. And I'm going to briefly discuss DNA towards the end of this talk. So just follow along with me. All right. Here I have a pre-drawn diagram of an atom right here. And if you remember, atoms are made of 3 subatomic particles. You have protons and neutrons, the former being positively charged and the latter being neutrally charged. And then on the outside, you have electrons, which are negatively charged. And by outside, I mean outside of the nucleus. The nucleus is, of course, made of protons and neutrons. Your positive and neutrals, and then the electrons are on the outer shells. Now, these outer shells right here are called energy levels. And the thing about these energy levels, this is very important. If you remember me saying very briefly that electrons are very charismatic. And here's why they're charismatic. Now, according to Bohr's model and Lewis Dot's theory or model, not sure if I'm using those terms. Just know that it's Lewis and Bohr. Those are like the 2 guys that came up with these models. Between the 2 of them, they determined that there are a certain number of electrons per energy level. Each of these rings represent an energy level outside of the nucleus. So the first energy level has a maximum of 2 electrons. Then the second energy level has a maximum of 8. Then the third has a maximum of 18. And then the fourth, which is where I'm going to stop, has a maximum of 32. That's as far as I'm going to go. Now, why is this important? Well, the thing about atoms don't like to be unstable. So they want to have full energy levels, or at least the outermost energy level. And this is me speaking metaphorically as if they have a personality. Atoms want to have a full outer energy level. Say, for instance, this last energy level being 32, if it only had 31, that one means that it's not stable. So that pretty much covers the first type of atom, stable. Now, stable just simply means that, at least of these 4, it just means that the outermost energy level either has a full set of electrons at capacity or it doesn't have any electrons at all. Now, the second type of atom I'm going to talk about is called the ion. Now, ions are really charismatic atoms because they are responsible for most of your chemical reactions, because technically speaking, your ions, they're either unstable or they create instability. Now, stable and unstable doesn't necessarily mean that it's harmful, not at least in this case. It just simply means that atoms are always looking to have a full energy level or a fourth outermost energy level. So ions kind of disrupt that, because ions by definition are just atoms that have either energy levels that aren't quite full, or they just have extra electrons in the outer energy levels. That's the simplest way I can put it. So those are the fundamentals of the atoms at that level. And notice how I talk about how atoms combining with other atoms of a different type makes a compound. That's how this occurs. Like, they either share or break off electrons in order to make a new substance. And sometimes the making of that new substance creates chemical reactions, which is like a main component of how our cells work. Now, let's go a little further. We're going to talk about some key elements here. Had to take a quick glance at my notes. Let me erase this here. Now, the elements I'm going to discuss, and this is another naming system that helped me remember the key elements that are involved in ATP and ADP makeup, among other substances. Now, I'm going to make this as fundamental as possible. I'm going to call this CHOMP. CHONP. All right, now this is where things get really cool. At least in my opinion, it gets really cool. CHOMP stands for carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now, I'm gonna grab a different color here. Now, as I stated in my last video, we are carbon-based creatures. So everything that's living, well, creatures is a very harsh sounding word. We are carbon-based organisms. Like, everything that's living on this planet is carbon-based. So this first group right here, or the first three rather, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, keep in mind, these are elements. And if you go back and watch the other video, elements are a group of atoms of the same kind. So you have the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These are very, very important, because not only do they make up our being, or at least they're the basis of our being, they're also important for certain substances that we utilize. And what substances are those? Fats and carbohydrates. Now, in later videos, I'm going to discuss the chemical formulas of different kind of carbs and different kind of fats, because even though they're all made of the same things, there's a different number of carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens that make up certain kinds of fat. But anyway, that's going deeper into chemistry territory, and I'll discuss that later. All right, here's where things get even cooler. You have this stuff called nitrogen. Oh, and by the way, side note, before I get into nitrogen, when you combine all of these elements together, they make compounds. So fats and carbohydrates, in essence, are just types of compounds made of a combination of these elements. And again, do not confuse this fact. Atoms of the same type make up an element. Remember that distinction. And then compounds are a combination of different kinds of elements. Do not get that confused. Cannot stress that enough. But anyway, when we throw nitrogen in the mix, a combination of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, this is the main basis for our proteins. And as I'm explaining this, I hope you're beginning to understand why different vitamins and minerals and things of that nature are important in our nutrition. Now, that's going to be another video down the line, but just follow me here. So a combination of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, that makes up the groundwork for your proteins. Now this last little bit right here, phosphorus. Now if you remember, when I expressed or stated the word ATP and ADP, the P stands for phosphate. That phosphate group is based on phosphorus. So I'm gonna draw a large arrow out here. Make that a little more clear. All of these combine in a certain combination, in a certain chemical formula, that makes up your ATP and ADP. Now remember, the only difference between ATP and ADP is the number of phosphate groups it has. ATP has 3, ADP has 2. I'm just gonna stop it there at the fundamental level. And also, the big one, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, at the right quantities of each, and I'm going to discuss the chemical formula of all 3 of these in the next video. These are also the things, or these are also the elements that make up our DNA. That stands for deoxyribonucleic acids. So, to wrap this video up, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, depending on the chemical makeup or the chemical formula, certain number of carbons, certain number of hydrogen, certain number of oxygen is gonna yield you certain kind of fats and certain kind of carbohydrates. I'm gonna discuss chemical formulas, the exact chemical formulas of those in another video. Then when you add nitrogen to the mix, CHON, that's the ground basis for your proteins. So there's that right there. And then phosphorus, combination of CHONP makes up your ATP, ADP, and your DNA. And to put the cherry on top that's gonna lead into the next video, just gonna erase this to make some room. You have this compound called H2O. That's water. 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. So that's what makes water. And the reason why I'm stating this is because this is going to make sense of ATP, ADP, and DNA because they have a similar numbering system as this H2O compound right here. So I hope you learned something. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus make up our being, and they are also the main ingredients to ATP, ADP, and DNA. Thanks for hanging 10. I'll see you in the next one.